Coming up on Philosophy Talk, the life and thought of Nísia Floresta.
A 19th century writer, translator, and educator from Brazil.
And a groundbreaking feminist. She published the first book on women's rights in Latin America.
Floresta is thinking about the philosophical foundations behind the construction of a nation.
Feminism, but with self-sacrifice.
Women as mothers, they have this natural role of being caretakers and the first educators and the first examples of virtue.
How did colonialism affect Floresta's thinking about women's rights?
Equality comes first. You have to be recognized as an equal in order to reclaim your social freedoms.
Our guest is Nastassja Pugliese from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro.
Education is what is socially learned through all kinds of interactions with others that we have in the social environment.
Nísia Floresta, coming up on Philosophy Talk.
On Wednesday, July 24th, come be part of a live recording of Philosophy Talk at KALW's San Francisco event space.
We'll be thinking about how to do things with your mind with Stanford philosopher Antonia Peacock.
This event is free and open to the public. More information at philosophytalk.org.
That's Wednesday, July 24th, 7 p.m. at 220 Montgomery Street in downtown San Francisco.
Do things with your mind. With us.
Everybody deserves an education, but what exactly should they learn?
What could it mean to be a conservative feminist?
Are women the same as men, or better?
Welcome to Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything.
Except your intelligence. I'm Josh Landy.
And I'm Ray Briggs. We're coming to you from the studios of KALW San Francisco Bay Area.
Continuing conversations that begin at Philosopher's Corner on the Stanford campus, where Ray teaches philosophy and I direct the Philosophy and Literature Initiative.
Today, it's the latest episode in our Wise Women series, generously supported by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. We're thinking about the life and thought of Nísia Floresta.
She is often called the Brazilian Mary Wollstonecraft because people thought her first book was a translation of Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women.
Yeah, even though we now know she was really translating a political pamphlet by someone who wrote under the name Sophia.
Yeah, but she does have some things in common with Wollstonecraft, like women's rights, for example.
Yes, just like Wollstonecraft, she called for women to have the same rights as men. That was part of her commitment to Cartesian dualism.
Yeah, if I understand correctly, she's basically following Descartes in thinking that the soul is totally separate from the body. So it doesn't matter if you're in a man's body or a woman's body or whatever, your soul has the same capacities. Women are just as smart and as competent as men, so why shouldn't they have the right to vote, to run for office, to contribute to public debates?
Exactly. And to do that, they need to be educated.
Which is something Floresta had a lot to say about. One of her most interesting thoughts, in my view, is that education isn't just a matter of teachers and schools.
Right. It also includes how you bring up your kids. When Floresta was writing, Brazil still had slavery, and people made slaves raise their children for them. Floresta objected to this. She strongly opposed slavery, and she said mothers should raise their own children.
I mean, mothers, okay, but what about fathers?
Well, she didn't have a lot to say about them.
I don't get it, Ray. I mean, okay, you and I agreed a moment ago that Floresta is calling for the equality of men and women. So why shouldn't she want them to be equal partners in the raising of children?
Well, she's sometimes called a conservative feminist. She thought women should have different roles from men, and they should cultivate feminine virtues.
Feminine virtues? Doesn't that idea put her in bad company? Look, Floresta was fairly well known for attacking Enlightenment philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for example. That guy was all about feminine virtues, right? I mean, look, I know Floresta's position isn't exactly the same as Rousseau's, but still, what makes her version any better than his version?
Oh, please. Rousseau was awful. He said women should be educated to please men. He says, to be pleasing in his sight, to win his respect and love, to train him in childhood, to tend him in manhood, to counsel and console, to make his life pleasant and happy. These are the duties of woman for all time, and this is what she should be taught when she is still young.
What's your problem with that? Okay, like that, yeah, that's pretty troubling. But I still don't see how Floresta entirely escapes some version of this. She's saying women have special duties, including things like self-sacrifice. I mean, that may not be as loopy as Rousseau, but is it fair to women?
Well, Floresta thinks it's good for women. It makes them morally better than men. Wouldn't you want to be morally superior?
At the cost of self-abnegation? It just seems like a high price to pay, Ray. I mean, on that logic, the most virtuous people around would be people with no freedom at all.
Yeah, and that's what she thought. In one of her essays, she talked about an African man who was forced into slavery, and she said he was spiritually superior to his captors.
I mean, that's inspiring in some ways, but it still leaves me with a worry. Why can't we have freedom and virtue, both at once?
That is ultimately what Floresta wanted. She believed in indigenous rights and in the abolition of slavery. And she thought virtue would absolutely survive in a world of universal freedom.
Look, I want that too. I just don't quite see yet how all the parts of Floresta's philosophy fit together.
Well, maybe our guest will help you. It's Nastassja Pugliese from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro.
But first, we'll take a little look into Floresta's historical context. We sent our roving philosophical reporter, Mary Catherine O'Connor, to find out what was happening in 19th century Brazil. She files this report.
We often think of things getting lost in translation. But back in 1995, a historian found something in translation that had been hiding in plain sight for 163 years.
My name is Maria Lúcia Garcia Palhares Burke, and I'm a research associate at the Center of Latin American Studies at the University of Cambridge.
One of the people Palhares Burke has studied is Nísia Floresta, a Brazilian intellectual born in 1810.
Nísia Floresta is claimed to be the first feminist in the country, and perhaps in South America. She certainly participated in the debates of the time about central issues such as women's education, women's rights, slavery.
We know that Floresta had a difficult early life. She either entered freely or was forced into a short-lived marriage at age 13. And then, when she was 17, she suffered the loss of her father, who was murdered. She may have had some education, but was likely self-taught.
Achieving a success that was not expected in a patriarchal and conservative country like Brazil.
And Floresta was long associated with philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft, not just because of their similar stances on women's rights, but because of translation.
In 1832, she published what was presented as the translation of a very progressive book by the British feminist Mary Wollstonecraft.
Except that's not actually what Floresta had published, as Palhares Burke discovered.
It all started with my interest in the circulation of ideas. I decided to put the two texts together. The so-called, that was presented as the free translation of Mary Wollstonecraft, with the actual text of Mary Wollstonecraft.
Palhares Burke wanted to see how they differed, because Floresta was believed to have made a loose translation of Wollstonecraft's vindication of the rights of women. But she discovered that Floresta had actually made a direct translation of a different feminist text, and in some ways a more radical one, by someone who wrote under the pseudonym Sophia, a person of quality. Palhares Burke was excited to share this news beyond her academic circles.
I thought it was going to be the beginning of a very interesting intellectual discussion.
But she got a chilly reception to an article she wrote for a newspaper in northern Brazil, where Floresta was born.
And it was a disaster. To my sadness, to my surprise, the Secretary of Culture of the Rio Grande do Norte wrote to the newspaper saying that I had offended her memory.
What's worse, she says, is that even 30 years since her discovery, the idea that Floresta had translated Wollstonecraft is still being repeated, even by some Brazilian teachers. Plus, Palhares Burke thinks that narrow focus obscures Floresta's larger contributions to social discourse in post-colonial Brazil.
Such as the situation of the indigenous population, the African slaves, and republicanism.
Floresta was also an educator and an author of many books of her own. She was outspoken and unconventional. We may never learn whether she knowingly deceived readers of her translation, but perhaps the bigger takeaway is that some things are unknowable.
There is a very interesting art historian, Ernest Gombrich. He says, history, both collective history and individual history, are like a Swiss cheese, full of holes, that the best research carried out by the best historians cannot really fill.
For Philosophy Talk, I'm Mary Catherine O'Connor.
Thanks for that super interesting report, Mary Catherine. I'm Josh Landy. With me is my Stanford colleague, Ray Briggs. And today we're thinking about the philosophy of Nísia Floresta.
We're joined now by Nastassja Pugliese. She is professor of philosophy and education at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro and author of the Cambridge Elements volume on Nísia Floresta. Nastassja, welcome to Philosophy Talk.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's great to have you on the program. Tell us, Nastassja, how did you first get interested in Nísia Floresta?
Yeah, my thought is I'm really moved by symbols and analogies, and I love a good metaphor. And when I first saw the full pseudonym of Nísia Floresta, which is Nísia Floresta Brasileira Augusta, I was like, what is this Brazilian forest? What is distinguished Brazilian about? So, and actually this immediately made me recall Antonio Cândido's famous dictum. He's a very famous historian of Brazilian literature. And he says very unfortunately that Brazilian literature is a secondary branch of the Portuguese literature, which is the second-rate bush in the great garden of muses. So this dictum always bothered me. And all of a sudden I kind of had with Floresta in front of me, not just a twig or a shrub, but a whole floresta, a whole forest to investigate. So it was eye-opening, heartwarming, and I had this sense of civic duty that impelled me to study her. So it was actually a good transformation of my view of philosophy and the history of philosophy.
Oh, that's great. So earlier, Josh and I were remarking that Floresta was a translator, and while she didn't actually translate Wollstonecraft, she had a lot in common with Wollstonecraft philosophically. Can you tell us more about what they had in common?
Yeah, I usually say that Floresta has been characterized as a Brazilian Wollstonecraft for the wrong and the right reasons. So she did not have a direct influence on Floresta. It was basically indirect. The main thing that they had in common is that both wanted to open space for women in the social sphere and also value the private sphere that they were in. And they also had this common enemy, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So both Floresta and Wollstonecraft were thinking about education as a tool for advancing women's rights. So I think that's basically where they are thinking together, although they did not have exactly the same sense of what virtue is, and were not actually defending the same view of virtue for women.
Well, any enemy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau is a friend of mine. But I wonder about one other connection there might be between Nísia Floresta and Wollstonecraft, and also Margaret Cavendish. We've done shows on both of those. If I understand correctly, all three of these thinkers point, among other things, to the tendency of this male-dominated society to cause women to focus on the wrong things. They cause women, instead of focusing on education and direct contributions to public debates and so on, instead to waste their time thinking about jewelry and dresses and so on. Does that seem right as a characterization of part of Nísia Floresta's thought?
Oh, that's right. Definitely, Floresta is going against the view that women should be educated to please men and to please others and take care only of their own looks and of their own bodies. So she's actually against doing physical interventions in order to become more pleasing to men. She's interested in the intellectual education of women. She thinks that it is the inequality that we see among men and women in society is due to the fact that women were prevented from engaging in the intellectual sphere that is necessary for their participation in the public sphere. So the first step for the public participation of women as governors in the military. She even defends that women could be in the military if they want. The first step is actually to take care of our own intellectual capacities and advance our learning.
You're listening to Philosophy Talk. Today we're discussing the life and thoughts of Nísia Floresta with Nastassja Pugliese from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro.
Should feminists be paying more attention to indigenous rights? What about the rights of children? Was Nísia Floresta conservative or ahead of her time?
Bringing up brilliant Brazilians, along with your comments and questions when Philosophy Talk continues.
Carcará lá no sertão.
Maria Bethânia and Carcará, a song about economic migration in Brazil, a popular theme in forró music. I'm Josh Landy, and this is Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything.
Accept your intelligence. I'm Ray Briggs, and we're thinking about the philosophy of Nísia Floresta with Nastassja Pugliese from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro.
It's the latest episode in our Wise Women series, which is generously supported by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Got questions about this groundbreaking South American thinker? Email us at comments@philosophytalk.org, or you can comment on our website. And while you're there, you can also become a subscriber and question everything in our library of nearly 600 episodes.
So, Nastassja, before the break, you were telling us that there's an interesting difference between Floresta and Wollstonecraft when it comes to the definition of virtue. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so Wollstonecraft defended the difference between private virtues and public virtues. And Floresta, she was sort of recognizing the public aspects of the private virtues. And we can actually find two moments in her theory of virtue. The one that starts on her translation of the feminist pamphlets, the Direitos, and then another one that we can find in writings such as Women. In the first moment of her ideas of virtue, she is defending the universality of intellectual virtues, meaning that both men and women have the capacity to think and to know. And the argumentative strategy that she develops involves describing how male dominance over women is pervasive, making them lack steam for thinking. And then they see themselves as intellectually inferior, but actually that's not the case. But at the end, what she's arguing in this first moment of her theory of virtue is that women are more eloquent than men, because if women do not have the legal structure to occupy the social space, if they do not have the advantages of having the right to occupy the public space, and if they're being able to convince men that they have the ability to occupy the public space, this means that they're more eloquent than men, because they are soon becoming able to occupy the space, even if they do not have the advantages of the law being on their side.
She has that great line, right? Women can persuade what they please without the help of laws, which is it's such a great argument for women's superiority and eloquence. And if I understand correctly, she's also claiming that women have a superiority in the domain of generosity, self-denial, care. Is that correct too?
Perfectly. That's the second moment of her theory of virtue, when she gets a little bit more detached from the influence of the social Cartesianism of the book that she translated.
Wait, the social Cartesianism? So help me out.
Yeah. It's just the idea of applying to the reading of the social structures of society the principles of Cartesian philosophy, such as the Cartesian dualism, that the mind is different from the body, and, for example, the idea that you have to question everything before you accept them as true. So that's the tradition of social Cartesianism. And she can be read as being part of, or at least dialoguing or criticizing this tradition. But when she's writing her own philosophy, kind of getting detached a little bit or moving away from social Cartesianism, she is defending the idea that there are properly female virtues. And I think that here we should read Floresta with a little bit of generosity ourselves, because she has a specific audience, which is 19th century Brazilian readers, which are actually the aristocracy of Brazilian society in the 19th century. So she wanted to convince these people that housework, that domestic work that caring for children and breastfeeding and being the head of the household is a virtue, is actually a civic, a way to contribute to society, right? So she wants to highlight the fact that the work that women do, not that what they should do. She's not talking about normativity here or what they should do, but she's talking about what they are doing and how we can actually value this labor. And then by doing that, she's elevating these virtues that are usually attributed to women, like self-sacrifice, generosity. Of course, she's a Christian philosophy. She's very Catholic. So she's actually here embracing a whole ethics of care that comes from the Catholic tradition. So she thinks that women should be moderated and not overestimate their capacities, because she does think that this is part of a strategy for women that women have to entertain social relationships. So moderation is actually a strategy. It's not that you should self-sacrifice and erase yourself, but she's actually recognizing, pointing out, denouncing in a way that motherhood involves self-sacrificing, and this should be valued.
So this is super interesting because I feel like there's a kind of deep critique of Cartesianism here, where the social Cartesianism, as you said, starts from this assumption that everybody is the same and has the same capacities. But then we have this observation that women in Floresta's society are just getting a bunch of different opportunities and denial of opportunities to grow their capacities, so that even if they start off the same as men, they're going to end up different. Do you think this is a fatal challenge to social Cartesianism? How should I understand it more in its philosophical context?
I think that Nísia Floresta is in the perfect place to make this critique, because she's experiencing the noxious effects of colonialism. We are talking about a moment where Brazil has just started to live as an independent nation, and a nation independent from Portugal. So in this sense, she is criticizing the heritage, the colonial heritage, the European heritage, and the way that Brazilians have been educated from the moment that the European colonizers arrived here to that point on. So she's using the language of Europeans as tyrannical oppressors, as ambitious colonizers who cause suffering by barbarian means. So she's looking at those ideas of the Enlightenment, because, of course, Brazil was not alienated from the intellectual developments of Europe, because there was a great traffic of ideas and of books in the Atlantic Ocean, right? So they were reading all the major exemplars or the major philosophers of the Enlightenment. But at the same time that these Europeans had these great ideas, these ideas were not being implemented in the colonies. So that's where the critique of Cartesianism comes into play. If there's if equality is a natural givenness, it's naturally given, well, it's not being rightly observed in the colony.
You're listening to Philosophy Talk. Today, we're thinking about 19th century Brazilian philosopher Nísia Floresta with Nastassja Pugliese from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. So, Nastassja, this is so interesting, sort of the clash between these Enlightenment ideals that Floresta is getting from Europe and how they're failing to play out in the Brazilian context she's in. And she seems much more aware that not all of the women in her world are upper class white women than I think a lot of Europeans writing around the same time. Why do you think that she has this sort of attention to enslaved women and indigenous women that we kind of often see not happening?
So Floresta is someone who is thinking about the ideas, the philosophical foundations that are behind the construction of a nation, not theoretically. So she is not like the social contract theorist who heard about noble savage, or as a group of indigenous nations that were living in an idyllic place in a faraway land in the terra incognita. She's actually there. She's seeing these people. She's seeing enslaved Black women and enslaved Black men. She's seeing indigenous women and indigenous men and indigenous child. And she's seeing the way that Brazilians, or those that are living and inhabiting Brazil, actually treat the foreigners, making them more easily incorporated to the culture than those who are actually there creating the country, right? So she's actually someone who is thinking in practical terms and taking her own experience as an object of thought, as an object of reflection.
Yeah, and she's thinking broadly about freedom and oppression, right? Because obviously she's a feminist. She's pushing for the equality of women, but she's also opposed to slavery. She's opposed to racism. She's opposed to colonization. And one of the things that fascinated me, if I'm understanding her correctly, is that she's one of the earliest thinkers to push the argument that injustice isn't just bad for the disadvantaged. It's bad for everyone. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a great contribution of Floresta, I think. So I want to go a little bit back in time, because for Floresta, she's not defending freedom in the same way that others are defending freedom as the core of every civil right. She's actually realizing, and this is very important, that equality comes first. You have to be recognized as an equal in order to reclaim your social freedoms. So what she's doing with her critique of colonialism is actually criticizing a mechanism that she's observing, which is people are being are suffering pain. Right? So inequality causes suffering, and inequality prevents the oppressed from experiencing their own virtues and capacities, right? So the instrumentalization of the suffering is a problem, because it actually is reproduced as a habit in the nation. So if, for example, you have in your household, we are talking about 19th century Brazilian households, if you have enslaved people inside your household and you treat them with violence, you're actually teaching your child that violence is okay, that it actually can and should treat someone who is inside your house with violence. So she thinks that the psychological humiliation that we see in colonization and the physical punishment is detrimental for the social understanding of dignity and for equality. So if we want a society based on freedom, we need to stop this mechanism of producing pain in others.
So this brings me to a thing that you've said about Floresta's ideas about education, where I think sometimes you read like European thinkers from around this period and they think like education is something that you build a school to do, and then you like take young women and you send them off to the school to get educated. But she's thinking of it in this much more holistic way, where part of it takes place kind of in your house when you're a kid, just watching how people interact with each other. So was like how did that insight kind of affect the people who read her or thought about her ideas and wrote after her?
Yeah, so Floresta influenced a lot of other women who actually took ownership of their own intellect and started to write about women's rights in the public sphere, in the print culture of the 19th century in Brazil. So and they were also engaging in the public sphere as educators. Usually they were women who were school directors, just like Floresta. So Floresta is thinking about education as what you do inside a school, but not limited to what you do inside a school, because she thinks that the school is alone cannot do the work that that society is supposed to do. So she thinks of education as encompassing what is socially learned through all kinds of interactions with others that we have in the social environment. So education is what happens in the church. It's what happens in the commerce when you're going to buy something at the local shop, and also what you do when you are inside the school learning content, historical content.
So does this bring us back to something you were saying earlier about the political potential of the private? Because you have, obviously she's talking a lot about mothers educating their children. We might think also of both parents. But is this idea that education isn't just something that happens in a school? It also happens out there in the social world, and it very much happens in the household. With parents bringing up their kids. Is this a version, is this an example of the hidden power that women have, even in this very patriarchal society?
Oh, yeah. Women as mothers, Floresta is not exactly a conservative feminist, I would say. She would say that she's not even a feminist because she's not she's not interested in being part of a political party that actually was constructed right after Floresta's death, right after she passed away. The first feminist party of Brazil was constructed by someone who was influenced by Floresta. But she herself was interested in the education of women. She wanted to think about curriculum and schools and how we should construct like social relations that give back the dignity of those people who have been stripped out of their dignity through the process of colonization. So women as mothers, they have this sort of natural role of being caretakers and the first educators and the first examples of virtue, of moral action for their kids. And their kids, would be future citizens of Brazil. So that was the way that she would connect women as mothers, as the primary caretakers, the primary educators, the primary moral examples, with women, the political role of women when they become able to occupy the public sphere. So in this sense, they have a lot to say when they become university professors and governors.
So this kind of makes me curious about like big concepts like conservative or feminist and how you even apply them in this case, because it sort of seems like what she's doing is making a bunch of practical interventions. Like she sees ways that the society around her is broken. And they're kind of like obvious when you're looking at the like if I imagine if you're looking at the face of like an enslaved person who's being hurt in your home, you can just see that there's a problem here. So one way we could understand Floresta is not as having really a grand philosophical, like theoretical project, but as having a very practical set of projects that she's just using the best available tools for. Do you think that that's a good description of her, or do you think that's selling her short?
No, I think that's an interesting description. It's not false at all, because she is a practical philosopher. And we should also think of her as someone who was self-educated. So when we think about great 19th century philosophers, they usually were either part of the European elite or they were inside universities. So they had some training that Floresta herself didn't have. So we shouldn't expect from her great treatises, right? So she is actually a practical philosopher, and she wants to induce practical transformations in the country. So I would just say that when we study great thinkers from the past, we should be careful with anachronism. So what is anachronism? Is this expectation of seeing the answers for our own contemporary questions on their writings. So we should be afraid of not expecting from Floresta or from any other what we would call proto-feminists. So those women who are actually paving the way for feminism as an organized movement to come about. So they were actually constructing the foundations. They were paving the way. They are not in a position to answer the practical questions that today we have, although they can, and they certainly do inspire us with their very interesting and enlightenment ideas about questions that today we have, like, for example, should women breastfeed?
You're listening to Philosophy Talk. Today we're exploring the life and thought of Nísia Floresta with Nastassja Pugliese from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro.
What kind of village does it take to raise a post-colonial child? how do you educate everyone without erasing anyone's culture? Can a 19th century thinker like Nísia Floresta help 21st century citizens live better lives?
Education without discrimination. Plus commentary from Ian Scholes, the 60-second philosopher, when Philosophy Talk continues. Brazilian singer Mariana Aidar and a samba song called Minha Missão, My Mission. I'm Josh Landy, and this is Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything.
Except your intelligence. I'm Ray Briggs. Our guest is Nastassja Pugliese from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and we're thinking about 19th century Brazilian philosopher Nísia Floresta.
It's part of our Wise Women series, generously supported by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. You can find all the episodes in this series at philosophytalk.org/wisewomen.
So, Nastassja, we were just talking about all the inspiration that Nísia Floresta's work can give us today. So what's one thing that you think that Nísia Floresta should inspire us to do now?
So I think that Floresta was a thinker of the notion, the concept of citizenship. So what it is to be recognized as a citizen in a nation. And I think this is a very important question for a global world, right?
Mm-hmm.
She is someone who is highlighting the fact that the first owners of the Brazilian land were actually stripped away from their lands by the colonizers. So Brazil actually is a nation that starts by moving away the rightful owners of the land from their own land. So what to do with that? She is looking at the indigenous nations and saying, there should be a way to recognize indigenous nations as citizens of Brazil, because they are like a founding stone of Brazilian nation. And then she's thinking about what to do. And one of the things that she's claiming that we should absorb in our educational goals is to see the habits of indigenous Brazilian women and incorporate as part of the Brazilian habits, the habits of Brazilian women in general. For example, breastfeeding one's child. So that, I think, is the first and foremost suggestion that she gives. But then after Floresta, we see for Leolinda Daltro, for example, she is willing to include indigenous nations as citizens of Brazil by teaching them how to read and write, because in this way they would have the capacity to vote and reclaim their own rights within the civil laws and the civil structure that was already built. So now we have this problem of how today we should look to indigenous schools and our interactions with indigenous people in the indigenous reserves that were created. And hey, one of the indigenous posts of the early 20th century in Brazil was actually named after Floresta.
Right. So I have some questions about this. I mean, particularly involving the Catholic Church, which in its efforts to educate indigenous people was like pretty brutal, I would say, and terrible. So I think one of my worries about this is sort of how to educate indigenous people where it's not just taking away their culture and replacing it with some European culture that you think is better. What might somebody Floresta inspired who is concerned about this have to say?
That's a very delicate issue because, yes, we cannot deny the violence that indigenous suffered from the Catholic Church within the juntas. But at the same time, the juntas were this intersection between their culture and the law. Right? So we can see examples of indigenous women who have been held captive. And they were able to reclaim their freedom by going to the juntas and reclaiming their freedom by means of a juridical legal process. And they were, these legal processes were actually judged, and they were protected by the law. Another example is Padre Antonio Vieira, who actually wrote the first dictionary of Tupi and Portuguese language. And this was a way of solidifying the territorial unity of Brazilian lands, because Portuguese was spoken from the north to the south of Brazil, and the indigenous were actually starting to learn the language of the oppressor in order to fight against them. So I know that if we were to go back in time, things should have been done differently. But the thing is that they were done this way. So what we can learn today from this fact that our civilization is still trying to strip indigenous nations from their own lands. They're still on the peril of losing their reserves and their richness due to, economic interest in their demarcated lands. So what are we going to do now in order to protect their land, and by using Floresta's own view of education, do good to them in a way that the whole society can actually profit from this good?
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. And there are other things, I take it, that we could learn from Floresta for today, perhaps slightly broader questions about her framework around education. The abolition of corporal punishment in schools seems like a good idea. It's largely been adopted. When I was growing up, that was still a thing, unfortunately, but not anymore. Another thing I really like in her way of thinking about it is that education is really for virtue. It's for morality. It's not to make money. And that would be a lovely thing to see adopted in schools and universities. I want to ask a difficult question that I have, which is about modes of instruction, because Floresta seems to be suggesting that although, she sides with René Descartes in saying that men and women are fundamentally the same because we're ultimately minds, and, there's nothing gendered about minds, she seems to call for different instruction for men and women. Can you say something about that and whether that's a model we should be borrowing today or should not be borrowing today?
So with respect to money, I think that's not educating for money. The problem is with excess, right? So she is asking us to become, to observe moderation. And with that, I will connect with your question because Floresta has a school for girls. So in 19th century Brazil, the first educational law is from the 15th of October from 1827, promulgated by the Emperor Peter II. And on that curriculum, on that educational law, we had a separation of school for boys and schools for girls. And they had different curriculum. It's impressive. So on that law, we can see that women should not be allowed to learn more than the 4 operations of arithmetic because it will be useless to their upbringing. So there's this idea of behind the curriculum of the school for girls that they should be educated for something useful, right? So in one sense, the context in which Floresta is thinking is a context where there is a separation, not only with respect to the gender of the schools, but a separation of the curriculum. And she's not interested in thinking about men's education because they already have it all. She's interested in forming future female citizens that are actually empowered and are able to help build a nation that is autonomous, self-sufficient, and aware of its own dignity.
So this actually kind of raises a question that the view that she's responding to says, well, women should only be educated for useful things. But then there's this question like, useful for what? And I think that Floresta has a different idea of useful for what in mind than a lot of her contemporaries, which have these really narrow pictures of what women's roles can be. So maybe the women right now around her are not being allowed to participate in democratic society as much as they could be. But that's a contingent fact. So, like, how should we even be thinking about a useful education? Like, there are some things that aren't practical if we have just a really narrow set of purposes, but then become practical if we care about citizenship in some broader sense.
Yeah, exactly. I think that a useful education is an education that is related with practical ability. So here in this context, we are talking about teaching someone how to knit and cook and carpentry. But nowadays, when we think of useful education, we do think about some knowledge that will allow us to perform a social function that will make us, be good citizens because we are doing our part. So it's a little bit different because nowadays the social division of labor is more complex to the point that those that have education, they are actually higher education. Going to the universities and so on and so forth, they develop intellectual virtue. So it's part of the labor. It's part of the intellectual labor is still labor, right? But at that time, we were talking about something much more mundane, like women being able to take care of the economy of the household. So nowadays, women have much more space to occupy in the public sphere. But still, I think that the fact that we are still in the need of talking about women's rights just is an indication that there's still a long way to go.
Well, you have certainly developed our intellectual virtue today. Nastassja, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you.
Our guest has been Nastassja Pugliese, professor of philosophy at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro and author of the Cambridge Elements volume on Nísia Floresta. So, Ray, what are you thinking now?
I've just really enjoyed the way that talking about Nísia Floresta has expanded what I'm thinking of education as being, like, where education happens everywhere and what it's for, like anything you could possibly do with it. So I think that she's much more on the side of ahead of her time than conserving sort of old things. She's just working with old tools.
Is there even education on the radio?
I hope so.
We'll put links to everything we've mentioned today on our website, philosophytalk.org, where you can also become a subscriber and liberate your mind in our library of nearly 600 episodes.
And if you have a question that wasn't addressed in today's show, we'd love to hear from you. Send it to us at comments@philosophytalk.org, and we may feature it on the blog.
Now, a man who talks a Brazilian miles an hour, it's Ian Scholes, the 60-second philosopher.
Ian Scholes, proto-feminist Nísia Floresta, was born in 1810 in Papari, in what was soon to become the independent nation of Brazil. Not much is known about her childhood, but she was self-taught to an amazing degree, learning English, Portuguese, French, Italian. Even as revolts and unrest swirled around her, she was married off at 13, but it did not take. She returned to the shelter of her family. Her father, a lawyer, was assassinated in 1828 at the order of a powerful member of the state. Nísia Floresta married and had 2 children, at which time her husband died. She began teaching to support herself and also writing. Unusually, she would publish in newspapers, which did much to spread her ideas. She was pretty unstoppable. She started her own school, not just a school, a college for women. A real college, too. No home ec here, teaching the classics and all the other things the boys learn. She resigned as director after 20 years and traveled to Europe with her daughter. There she met Victor Hugo, Auguste Comte, and returned to write more newspaper articles, which were compiled into 1 volume. And she wrote 2 other books and volunteered as a nurse during a cholera epidemic in Rio before returning to Europe in 1856, only returning to Brazil in 1872, where she remained until her death in 1885. Now, she was the first in Brazil to champion women's rights, also the rights of Native Americans and slaves. Some modern readers of her life and work have wondered how radical she really was, because she did not call for the torching of the patriarchy, or even that there was a patriarchy, unless you consider paternalism as its equivalent. Instead, perhaps influenced by Comte, she seemed to believe in change from within. After all, she and everybody had seen what happens with revolutions, in France anyway, guillotines, and then Bonaparte. Let's be sensible, ladies. Her idea being, it seems that when we are all equally educated, paternalism loses its soft power. And we can all, guys and gals alike, mansplain ourselves into an incremental utopia. As she wrote, quote, as a paternal government is the most proper one to make people happy, and a properly cultivated intelligence of those nations is the best incentive for them to fulfill their duties, so too is the moral education the safest guide to women, unquote. She may have meant this ironically, who knows, but maybe it is just safety first. She ought to know, having been a child bride and having a parent shot, society is much easier to change than the ideological underpinnings of a nation. Quote, the lack of a good education is the primary cause that contributes to women to lose their north, which is nothing else but morality in the midst of the corruption of society, unquote. Men, she seems to say, quote, always seeking to hold their intelligence, to weaken their senses. They make women unable to occupy the care of purifying their heart. Women would never achieve such a thing if their intelligence remains without culture, unquote. So, fellas, what do you say? Give the gals a break. It's just culture. We know you can live without it. It's harder for women, you know? I gotta go.
Philosophy Talk is a presentation of KALW San Francisco Bay Area and the trustees of Leland Stanford Junior University. Copyright 2024.
Our executive producer is Ben Trefny. The senior producer is Devin Strolovich. Laura McGuire is our director of research.
Thanks also to Pedro Jimenez, Merle Kessler, and Angela Johnston.
Support for Philosophy Talk comes from various groups at Stanford University and from subscribers to our online community of thinkers.
And from the members of KLW Local Public Radio San Francisco, where our program originates. Support for this episode, and all the episodes in our Wise Women series, comes from the National Endowment for the Humanities.
The views expressed
or misexpressed
on this program do not necessarily represent the opinions of Stanford University or of our other funders.
Not even when they're true and reasonable. Our conversation continues on our website, philosophytalk.org, where you can become a subscriber and question everything in our library of nearly 600 episodes. I'm Josh Landy.
And I'm Ray Briggs. Thank you for listening.
And thank you for thinking.